During the day on 24th July, there was a massive increase in checkpoint and road closures across the occupied West Bank. This was a direct consequence of the killing of 6 people, 4 of them Palestinian and 2 of them Israelis, who were both at the same time reservists and settlers, that occurred during a settler march that had followed a series of arson attacks in the Palestinian village of Tel, a rural village in the Nablus area. 3 days later in Nablus, a 28-year-old pregnant Palestinian woman from a village just outside the city gave birth in an ambulance after detours and was being held for over an hour and a half until, according to the ambulance crew, soldiers finally permitted them to turn their equipment and engine back on and continue to the hospital past the gates. While critically ill, the mother survived. The baby did not. I believe it's important that we examine what these stories have to do with each other besides just their geography. For anyone who has spent time in Palestine waiting for hours at these yellow gates, it's probably not surprising at all that this was the outcome of the Israeli policy. And it's also the same reason that these off-road vehicles are priced at a premium in Palestine. You'll get familiar with these yellow gates if you spend any time there. Ostensibly, they're called security gates, though there's not really any sort of checkpoint. They just form a barrier to movement. In practice, their purpose is to add friction and restrict movement, as it has become increasingly difficult and reliable for movement between cities by Palestinians. Some gates and roads close consistently and have remained closed for 20 years. Some open and close daily without any predictable pattern. And some, such as the road in the village of Beit Umar, closed suddenly and remained closed for the last few years after, in my understanding, a Palestinian child in the area threw a rock at an armored vehicle in 2018. Collective punishment is generally the approach the army often takes to Palestinian communities. The road checkpoints and barriers make travel between cities wildly unpredictable. My own trip from Hebron to Nablus for sightseeing via this Palestinian survey bus system took about 2 hours to get there, an ideal time. On the other hand, the return trip took about 8 hours, requiring us to drive nearly around the entire West Bank just to get back, to avoid a whole bunch of barriers and closed checkpoints on that day. Roads between settlements and Israeli-only crossings go back to the 67 border are typically well-maintained and open. However, these roads connect Israeli settlements to each other and to Israeli cities. And if they were even accessible to Palestinians, wouldn't really be useful for the routes that they need. So what does the shooting in Tel and the labyrinth of roadblocks have to do specifically with the stillbirth? No special consideration is given to the ambulances at these checkpoints, regardless of circumstance, and much is up to the disposition and mood of particular soldiers on that day. Unfortunately, Poles, largely so, Israeli society views Palestinians as collectively responsible for attacks against both Israeli military and civilian targets, and inherently hostile to all Jews. In this view, harm visited upon any random Palestinian can be metabolized and justified as a righteous justice for some sort of past wrong. So why do I think this is important for us as doctors? I think many of us grew up middle class or even above in Europe and North America. And those of us who are old enough to remember the world before 9/11, GWOT, and the Great Recession, there's a narrative that I still think persists and is sort of a background assumption that despite all the problems, most of the major conflicts and the problems in the world were solved and are just a matter of maybe particular individuals doing bad things and unintentional consequences of the system, rather than systemic failures or deliberate outcomes. We hear about cutting edge and best practices, but I think a lot of the harm and disease burden going on in the world, whether it's from Palestine or Sudan or Los Angeles, is not a matter of failing to implement the best practices, but is a choice of the policies inflicted upon those with less power. It could be ethnic supremacism, profit maximization, or a number of reasons. I think our social structure, in many ways, facilitates allocation of resources away from people who need it to people who don't. The specifics can always be complicated, but I believe the simple reason is really not that complicated. It's resource allocation and resource access. Why is it that some people in many countries could drive a few minutes, see a doctor that they made an appointment just a few days ago and get something checked without really any hassle, while someone else in other parts of the world would need to navigate hours of roadblocks or just doesn't have access at all? Why have I seen in a Hollywood ER a woman who had to come in, fake a psychiatric emergency because she couldn't afford to refill her medication? We collectively make choices on who is allowed basic human dignity and who is not every day, and most of the time with little consideration for what these choices mean. And I hope none of us lose sight of this. And I hope more so that none of us lose sight of our shared humanity.